Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third Proost podcast. And we are delighted to say that today we have a guest to come and talk to us, who is Jonny Baker. So welcome, Jonny.
Hi, great to be with you.
I'm sure lots of you will already know something about Jonny through one of his many kind of different personas. But I just made a quick note of what I suppose we're talking to him today as the entrepreneur who was one of the people that was behind the first incarnation of Proost. But we could maybe say musician, DJ, pioneer, minister, trainer. I'm sure there's all sorts of other labels that we may come on to first of all. But yeah, what I'll do as well is I'll stick some links to some of Jonny's very long-running blog that's down in the show notes as well, so people can kind of connect with some of the other things that you're up to at the moment. So welcome, Jonny. First of all, I think we're going to talk a little bit, if we can, about Proost as was, because you're the man to know these things. So I think Rob is going to talk to you a little bit about that first, and then we'll have a chat a little bit down the line.
Yeah, hi Jonny, and once again, I'll just reiterate, thank you so much for joining us on this third attempt at a podcast. I'm hoping it's actually recording, that we won't have to do this again, because the last time we did a podcast, I think it was version 3 that we managed to actually record something. My voice was conspicuously absent. Please, Jonny, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we kick off, for the sake of the listener who may not know who you are?
Yeah, sure. I'm Jonny. I live in London. I'm married with 2 lads who are both now married. I have 3 grandchildren, so that's a lot of fun. I'm kind of in the second half of life, I suppose. In terms of me, I've worked pretty much my whole life in the church space, encouraging mission, I suppose, first with young people and then more latterly with what the Church of England calls pioneers, but, creative people who are connecting with people largely outside of the church in communities, hopefully in creative and imaginative ways. I currently work with the Church Mission Society, where I've been for about 20 years now. I oversee their work in Britain, which all sounds very grand. But I mean, the headline of that really is we're focused on what we consider to be a post-Christian context. So lots of opportunity for engaging with people beyond the stretch of church, shall we say.
Right, thank you. There's so much I could already go off on a tangent on, so I'm conscious of trying to stick to script here. All that stuff about it sounds like there's still a place for emerging or different aspects to faith then, even in the world that we live in. But can you tell us perhaps a little bit about how Proost began? I mean, what sort of prompted what Proost was in its very earliest incarnation?
Yeah, I mean, I have a vivid memory of how Proost began, actually, so that's quite straightforward. I mean, at the time I lived in Bath, I was involved in youth work, but had been involved in, I suppose quite a few creative youth ministry things. I'd bumped into alternative worship through being given a cassette, I think, from the late service, which was very, very exciting. It probably still sounds great, I don't know, but at the time it just opened up a whole new world. But I mean, we'd got into writing some of our own songs, recorded a couple of things, and recorded 1 or 2 things with, I can't even remember what the label was, but with a Christian record label. And, that was fine, but we were having a conversation down the pub about it and the process of that, the aesthetic of it and how they tried to sell it and what they wanted to make you look like when they photographed you, etc. And we essentially decided we didn't really like what was going on, so we should set up our own record label. And there was a conversation between three of us, myself and John Birch, who's been a big contributor to Proost over the years, and Ad Fairmaiden, and Ad was Dutch, and we were in a pub having a beer, and he just said Proost, which means cheers, and we said, oh, we'll call it that. So we did. So that's the origin story, it's cheers in Dutch.
There we go, all looking around for something deep and meaningful, eh?
Oh well, no, that's it. That really is it. But it was initially to publish music, set up a record label, and I actually can't even remember what the first recording was. It might have been the Grace album, or it might have been a thing called The Year of Jubilee. It all blurs in my mind slightly, but yeah. Anyway, we kind of saw it as a way of initially publishing our own music, and of music with other people who we thought that would be helpful too. But it was always a very small, homespun affair. I mean, I remember the Grace album. We essentially borrowed to print, I think it was 1,000 CDs and 500 cassettes. And then make the money back through sales, and then you could do another project. That was sort of how it worked early on.
And so, when was this?
Oh, now, yeah, the older you get, the more blurry. I
mean, which decade was it, Johnny?
It was in the 90s. It was definitely in the 90s, and
Good.
It was pre-starting a blog, so I have no archive of it. Now I can go back and look on a blog and remember when we did particular things. But certainly the Grace album was 1997. That was shortly after I'd moved to London. And then I mean, certainly I remember Labyrinth was one of the things that we did on Proost, and that was in 2000. So, yeah, I think it was the late. And Backbone, was on Proost as well. That was 1998, I think, which was a angry, sad political album about Palestine, which I have just been teaching myself those songs again on acoustic guitar, funnily enough, because it feels like their time might be now as well.
Good grief. Yeah. It's longer ago, if that's not too bad English, it's longer ago than I thought. I mean, I think even Chris and I dared imagine or dared remember that it's actually now, therefore, nearly 25 years ago, not 15 to 20. So,
well, I mean, I think in terms of that creative imagination around resources, I mean, obviously people in youth ministry were doing stuff, but I think alternative worship with the late service and others, that was definitely in the 90s, 90, that's a good question, isn't it? 91, 92, 93, that sort of time. Grace, which is the community I'm still part of, began in 1993,
Okay. What did church look like then, back in the mid-90s and late 90s and early 2000s? What was church like?
Well, I mean, I think now this might be hard to imagine. I think it's looser around the edges now, thanks to, youth ministry, charismatic renewal, or fresh expression stuff or whatever. It depends where you are, whether it feels loose around the edges. But I think broadly speaking, it definitely is loose around the edges. I mean, it's quite hard to remember this in some ways, but I remember when I was in Bath, and one of the things that we set up was a nightclub to do stuff with young people outside of church. We actively discouraged Christian groups from coming. We didn't want it sort of subverted, but I remember then that, church planting and certainly the language of youth church was deemed to be quite controversial. So we talked about discipling young people in the context of the club. That was much sort of safer language for what became much more commonplace through fresh expressions and so on. So yeah, I think it was a different space. Some of the newer things were probably seen to be much more of a threat then than perhaps, well, maybe some people still see things as a threat. I don't know, but you know what I mean. So I would say it's loose around the edges, but you had. I mean, I think particularly alternative worship came out of, in the maybe late 60s, 70s, there was a sort of wave of charismatic renewal in Anglican churches and other places and outside. You had the house church movement and whatever. And
Yeah.
broadly speaking, I think that was quite a freeing movement in the church. You know, it was, I mean, you may think it's still very clerical, and it is, but certainly things like body ministry and all these sorts of things, realizing that other people might be able to do things. I think there was something quite good and freeing about that. But by the time all worship started, I think there was a certain amount of disillusionment with that and the way that it just seemed to have coalesced around a new set of apostles and control. So
Right.
alternative worship, in my view, was a kind of move away from that to try and deconstruct the front in some way, as well as a turn towards, I suppose, the beginnings of what we were thinking of as post-modernity.
Yeah.
So the very first thing I remember around alt worship and connecting with other people was there was a newsletter that came out of Greenbelt called Regenerate.
Right.
And there was a list of emails on the back of it. I don't know if you were on that list, Chris, or not, but, you know, there were a few groups around.
Slightly before our time, but I do remember the magazine.
Yeah. So you could either ring people up or email them. And email was new, so maybe it was even phone numbers in those early days. But there was a very early email discussion group called Postmodern Christian. You know, that was before the language of alt worship even, and I think that was the first space where people started talking about black theology, feminist theology, you know, all these things. So the alternative worship thing, I think, was quite an informed theological movement, as well as it wasn't just about shifting taste. You know, that's my memory of it, but this is rewinding quite a long time ago.
No, I think that's really helpful because Chris and I have been speaking about the roots of Proost, and also if it's got a version or a identity or a direction for 2024 and onwards, where is the theology in that? So actually you saying that in those early days of alternative worship and so on, that it was very grounded, regardless, you know, the language was new, but it needed to be grounded in some sort of theology. I think that's really interesting. So thanks for sharing that bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a quest to connect faith with culture, whatever that means. And part of that cultural question for some began with working with young people. But then you realise, this was the journey for me, then you realise your adult friends were culturally distant. And then the whole postmodern thing was a very energising, exciting thing to think that actually there's this wider cultural shift taking place and engaging with that. So I think that was theological and political in the sense of how do you organise a church, think about ministry, declericalise it, or whatever you want to say. Yeah, I think those were all live questions. Yeah.
So if we go back a little bit to Proost itself, it started off then as a record label, essentially. And how did it morph or develop into what it ended up in the 90s and the 2000s, I suppose, when I first came across it? Chris and I were reflecting and asking where we first came across Proost, and you've already mentioned it was Labyrinth, and I actually saw on one of your posts on Facebook today that you're doing a Labyrinth somewhere in the country.
Yeah, last night.
Any minute now. Okay, it's done. So that's still going, which is, I think, we were reminiscing on a tin box that arrived one day, which I ordered, and I can't.
Yeah.
That must have been in the. Well, you said it was in about 2000, so it probably wasn't about 2000 that I ordered it in a tin box.
Yeah, it might have been slightly later. Yeah, we first ran it in 2000. Yeah, I mean, again, my memory's slightly blurry, but I think in terms of resourcing wider than music, one of the significant things for me around alternative worship, because I think alternative worship was such a creative movement, because there were, you know, it was photography, moving image, liturgy, I don't know, ritual. There were just a whole lot of creative things going on that none of us had imagined or thought about before. And And I remember going to visit Doug Gay when he was a minister in Hackney, and we were talking about the idea of whether we could publish some resources that were around, and we ended up doing this collection called Alternative Worship as a book, and it had a CD-ROM with it, which had some music tracks and videos and whatever. And but in that encounter with Doug, one of the things that took place was that we were talking about the kinds of stuff that was around, and he pulled off the shelf a CD and played a track that had been recorded by Andy Thornton for an Advent service that was it was kind of a song imagining Zechariah in the temple. And it was so beautiful and so amazing. And I said to Doug, well, how many people have heard this track? And he said, I don't know, there were, probably a dozen people at the service or something. And then it had just been on the shelf. And that was like a little parable to kind of think, well, this really deserves a wider airing, or it would be great if these gifts could be shared in some way. So that ended up in publishing the book Alternative Worship. But I think quite soon after that, we began to have conversations about Proost and thinking, self-publishing became reasonably easy through online platforms like Lulu, I think we used for the pocket liturgy books and some of your poetry books, Chris. But also downloading became a possibility. So, but it was that encounter, I think, that etched itself into my mind. There was this sort of treasure produced by brilliant creatives that was shared with 8 people in a darkened room, that could be shared wider. And I remember, on the podcast I listened to, that you guys were talking about Cy Smith's 40, and that was another really good example, I think, of something just beautiful and amazing. And, how could... I suppose it was just a question of not just how could that be shared, but could you make a connection between artists who were making stuff and a wider audience, and coupled with that founding story of Proost, that it just felt like, and this isn't meant to offend anyone, but it felt like the aesthetic of the Christian publishing world was just, rainbows and crosses and sunsets. I mean, in fact, we had an argument.
Yes.
We had an argument with the publisher over the cover of Alternative Worship, and they tried to insist that we accepted one of 2 covers, one of which was someone standing with their hands in the air with the sunset behind them. I can't remember what the other one was. But we basically refused, and I ended up in a boardroom discussing the merits of Helvetica as a font. I mean, it just seems ridiculous, but the aesthetic was really, really important, and it just felt like the kinds of things that we were making and were being made had no place at the Christian publishing imagination. That just felt much more mainstream, much more, to be honest, much more cheesy, I would say. But so a number of things came together, but I think it was definitely helped by the technologies that you could... I mean, I can't remember at what point we shifted to download rather than, we published a number of physical books, but then at some point we moved to a subscription format where you could, subscribe, and then you'd be able to download the music or whatever it was. Yeah, I mean, but it was always small. It was always had a homegrown feel to it. So I don't know if that helps. That's all a bit blurred together. I mean, one of the other conversations I remember in the Proost story was meeting Shannon Hopkins, who you guys may not know. She's not somebody who's an artist who's contributed to Proost, but she'd come over as to get involved in mission in London from Texas, but had a background in business. And I met her for a coffee, and one of the things we talked about was Proost. And I said, to be honest, it's a bit like a hobby, we do it in our spare time. Mm-hmm. And I remember her saying to me, that's your problem, it looks like a hobby.
Okay. No.
Rude.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it was off the back of that conversation that we began to think, okay, well, what would it look like if it was a bit more, well, a bit less ad hoc and had a bit more of some sort of enterprise model around it? And I think we decided to move to a subscription thing off the back of that. I mean, in some ways that was good, and in other ways I think we created a monster that we just had to feed, and that nearly
Yes,
killed us
I
at the
think
same
you told
time,
me that. Yeah.
So yeah.
I think that's exactly what you told me when we spoke. I think you said that's one of. I don't want to use the word problem because it's the wrong word. But yes, it creates that monster, didn't it? That you had to start instead of stuff just being coming out of churches and alternative worship and being made available. You ended up, I presume, I'm putting words in your mouth here. You had to almost make sure there was a constant supply of stuff that people might.
Yeah, it was a monthly demand for new stuff. Yeah, I mean, it was a mix. Sometimes that naturally appeared, and other times you had to hunt it down or ring John up and say, right, you're going to have to do a couple of animations by the end of the week or whatever. Yeah, that was how it rolled. and I should say the founders of Proost was me, John Birch, and Ad Fairmaiden. So it was the three of us, and we were all involved in the same church in Bath at the time. I mean, Ad moved subsequently to Canada, but he was running a web company business. I don't know what you call it now, but that was the sort of thing it was back then. So he designed the infrastructure for the site and downloads and so on. John was very much the kind of animator, illustrator, artist, and I was the guy who was, I mean, I made some stuff, but I was the networking everybody and able to kind of connect people up. It was a sort of, that combination kind of worked for quite a few years. So, yeah.
And how long did it go on for?
Well,
you became a bit more professional, shall I say then? Did you start having to commit time to it properly, or did you pay someone to run it?
It was always spare time, yeah. So we always did it in our spare time. And it was, I mean, people got, sort of, the money that people got would be on a royalty basis. And from the get-go, we decided to sort of do a 50-50 split between Proost and the artists. And obviously we had costs in terms of web hosting and whatever. I mean, the normal Christian publishing world as then, you'd be lucky if you got 10%, because they'd hold originations against you. Once they were recovered, you might then get some royalties after that. So 50% was a generous deal, but we weren't selling a lot of stuff. But it always felt, I don't know what you felt like, Chris, but, come January and we worked out the royalties and you got, I don't know, 110 quid or something. It wasn't something you planned for, so it always felt like a bonus. But I mean, in terms of how long it ran, we passed it on to Andy Freeman. Oh, I don't know when that was. Yeah, maybe that was a decade ago or so, something like that, I would think. And Andy ran it for a while, yeah. So, it ran, it probably had a good 15 years or so life, I would think. But I'm guessing. I can't. I'm not very good with timelines unless I look back on my blog.
Yeah. And what were you most proud of? I'll hand over to Chris in a second, but what do you think you were most proud of in terms of Proost?
I mean, I love the sort of what you might think of liturgies from below. So, we published this series of books, Pocket Liturgies, and rather than, this is a very Church of England mindset, would be that you have a liturgical committee and they're the sort of controllers and the gatekeepers, the liturgical thought police who will filter everything down to its sort of pure theological Anglican form, and then it can be doled out to people. This was the complete opposite of that. We don't believe in that world at all. What's much more interesting is where people on the ground are writing and producing liturgy, which sometimes people talk about liturgy as being the work of the people. This was the work of the people. This was the work of communities that were offering their amazing things. And we had the privilege of sort of offer, making that available more widely. So, I mean, the things I was proud of wasn't one piece of art or one thing. It was just that there was this grassroots movement voicing in its own way soulful, artful worship, poetry, ritual, that was at times bizarre and at times wonderful, and it didn't matter. I mean, the other thing was I don't think we ever censored anything. I mean, if we didn't think something was good enough to publish, we might have gone back, but it wasn't a kind of, you've got to get it past the theological gatekeepers. Part of the beauty of it was that it could be available in its rawness and with its edges, So I think that's the thing. I still love that, and I'm very committed to, now working with pioneers and so on. I love it where the imagination connects with people's contexts and communities and comes out of that and has that particularity, that granularity, rather than it's sort of somehow sifted and filtered through some thought police process.
That's lovely. Thank you. I really appreciate that. That's really enlightening. Chris, do you want to move on? I don't want to take up too much time.
I mean, it's quite surprisingly emotional to think back over some of this journey, because you're describing some of my journey as well, Jonny, and from a very different perspective. It's just, and as I think back on those early days of Proost, there was a degree of chaos about it, but it always felt like a very generous chaos. Which, because as we've been talking about, restarting something, the different things of the creativity, but the community that came together around that seems to be really important, and the connections that gave to people like me who are up in the wilds of Scotland. I'm also remembering things like the Tautoko network, which seemed to be you were involved in that and setting that up around the time. And I mean, was the community always part of the deal for you too?
I think I don't know if we use the word community. It was probably just friendships, but I think there was. I mean, it's hard to remember back, But when I started blogging, for example, you'd met various people, but it didn't feel like there were that many people online doing that. So, but you could quite quickly connect with people and become friends. And I think Greenbelt became a real hub through the worship side of what was happening at Greenbelt. And in large part, that was because Doug Gay was coordinating worship for Greenbelt. He then handed on the baton to me. I handed on the baton to Gail Findlay, who at the time was in a group in Bristol, Alt Worship. She handed it on to Ben Edson, who was running a group in Manchester. He handed it on to Martin Poole. I hope I haven't missed anyone here. Apologies if I have. But there was, I don't know how long that period is, but, we hosted, different kinds of things, one of which was the Labyrinth. But there were at one time two venues, called New Forms. One was a sort of installation type venue, interactive, and the other was hosting groups like Uri or Grace or whatever, doing things. And, we just picked up stuff that we, from Proust's point of view, that would then publish. And I don't know if, I never thought of it as a Proust community, but there was definitely a community or a network or both of people that were just being creative, and stuff was popping up and emerging, and you just get an invite in. And again, I think that sort of control of what the edges of it was very open. So, I remember a goth Eucharist at Greenbelt, and it included breaking a circuit board for the Eucharistic moments, a sort of cyber feminist Eucharist. That's right. Yeah. So some of the stuff was quite out there, but that was all fine. It's great. Bring it on.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think there was a community. I mean, the other thing that happened at the similar time was I began working for Church Mission Society in 2002. That was a new role, and my role there was national youth coordinator, but it was part of a team that was also set up to engage in mission in the emerging culture. So quite quickly, all of this emerging church conversation, as it was tended to be called then, was happening. And within 2 years, we'd appointed someone else to do the youth stuff, and I was kind of doing that, engaging in the emerging culture. So the Tautaco network that you mentioned, Chris, was something I was able to do in my role at CMS, to give some time to networking and pulling together leaders, and that was seen to be part of the role, encouraging that mission practice and movement. So that was where the capacity, I suppose, came for that kind of a thing. But yeah, I mean, you know, it was definitely an energetic, very creative time, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. And I suppose one of the things that I'd like to do is to kind of try and set some of that in its context now as well, because I mean, I think you, in my kind of way of thinking, deserve a lot of praise for the way that you were able to connect people, and just in terms of, maybe community is not the right word, maybe almost like a tribe that grew out of that, of people that kind of had read the same books, had kind of understood, maybe gone through some degree of deconstruction of some of the evangelical stuff that many of us had grown through into something else. And I suppose, in my way of thinking, the Proost resources were always the kind of the creative output of that tribe. The question for us now is, where is that tribe? And, you know, does it still exist? Does it exist in a different way now? Are we now the sort of the yesterday's tribe, and has it moved on to something else, or has that just become dispersed with the kind of the huge outpouring of chaos that the internet has thrown upon us since, and you know, all the other changes that have happened in the last kind of 10 years, not least the pandemic? So there's a big rambling question, Johnny. Make what you want of that. Does the tribe still exist?
Yeah, I think so. Yes. I mean, it's probably broadened out, diversified. Maybe they're different groups and flows. I'm not quite sure. I mean, one of the thoughts you're making me realise, which I have thought about before, but not for a while, is that Proost we never strayed into publishing, if you like, theological or missiological books. It always remained on the more sort of artful, soulful. So it was poetry, liturgy, visual arts, photography, music. But we decided it wasn't our bag to start publishing a line of missiological or theological books, although I think we could easily have done that, to be honest, but I tended to do that in other ways. So yeah, you're making me think of that. But I mean, I think in terms of what has happened, I mean, I did write a blog post where I tried to summarize my view of the last 20, 30 years, called How We Got Here, which, if I remember, I'll send you a link to. But in that I kind of trace charismatic renewal, youth ministry, the postmodern shift, alternative worship, emerging church. Parallel to those two things was a kind of church planting move, which in some ways was much more broad and inclusive of a lot of the things that we were probably connecting with, as well as more, it's a funny thing to say, isn't it, traditional kind of church planting in those days. And then, Fresh Expressions, Mission Shaped Church was published in 2004. And I think what happened at that point, I remember a conversation with the now Bishop of Oxford, Stephen Croft, who was the first appointee to lead the Fresh Expressions thing in the Church of England. And we sat down at Greenbelt, and he drew the diffusion of innovation bell curve diagram, where in terms of culture change, or a new introduction of a new innovation, you have a front 5% or so that are the early adopters, and then you have a big swathe,
Yeah.
which is the early majority, then the late majority, and then the laggards. And what he said in that conversation was really helpful, because there was a little bit of sort of, I don't know, friction maybe between some of the emerging alt worship guys and some of the fresh expressions things that were coming on board. They just felt a little bit safe and a little bit mainstream. And Stephen Croft said that he thought that the kinds of things that, I mean, he used myself and Andrew Jones as example of two people, the sorts of things that we were doing and CMS were doing. And he said emerging church and alternative worship, they're in that front 5 percentile. You know, you guys are the early adopters. That's your space. But what I've got to do in Fresh Expressions is work with the early majority. So what I do is going to feel a bit safer. It's going to feel more mainstream, and that's because I need it to, and it has to, if this is to move into that space. So that was a really, really helpful conversation to me, and I've reiterated that to a few other people, because in terms of culture change, which, you know, depends on what your theory is on these things, but I think that there is a sort of wider cultural change that we've been privileged to be part of and still going on. That diffusion is still taking place, but you definitely need more than just the people who are out there on the edge, you know. So, but in answer to your question, my experience is that there are a lot of people innovating. There are a lot of people who've got frustrated and moved beyond the formal structures of church. I mean, I very much think they're still part of that space. And I think there's quite a lot of new forms, you know, of things popping up in all sorts of places, but they're not being documented in the same way, I don't think. So you got to sniff around and find them. And I mean, I passed on Proost to Andy when I became not overwhelmed, but, you know, when I set up training at CMS for pioneers, you know, I was navigating university system on the one hand, trying to navigate the Church of England to get approval to train ordinance and do something that had a good pedagogy and managed to be creative in the middle. I mean, that nearly killed me, to be honest. And trying to run Proost at the same time, it just became unsustainable. So that was the point at which I passed that on. And to be honest, that was the point at which I probably drank less coffee with people in other cities around the country and blogged a bit less about some of those things. So, but I mean, I have talked with a number of people more recently about, you know, it feels like it could do with a new wave of new, you know, documenting, shining a light on new forms of things that are happening, but where they are and who's doing them, I don't know. And I mean, just the last thought on this splurge is that I would say there's a lot of people who are in spaces that are not organised groups of church. I mean, I think last time when you were talking about the podcast, you mentioned Nomad, for example, as a kind of gathering point of people. I mean, I agree with that. But my own sense of that is that is a mission movement. You know, I mean, there's research into this, particularly in Scotland, Chris. You may be aware of Steve Aisthorpe's work that he's
and some new work being done in Aberdeen University at the moment, which you may have heard of.
Oh, okay. Oh, no, I don't.
I'll send you the link.
Yeah, great. But, you know, Steve's work's really, really interesting. I mean, it echoes previous research, you know, churchless faith and gone but not forgotten. All of these bits of research have shown that people that have moved beyond their ways of attending church beforehand have not abandoned faith. They've left church often for the sake of their own faith or their own sanity, or they've left church for the sake of mission. Now, they might not like the word mission in a colonial environment, but in terms of participating in good in their communities, their love of God, of Christ is still very much there. It might change and move. They might perhaps engage with festivals, read books, read poetry, go to webinars online, or listen to podcasts, or meet people for coffee, or it's just moved into another space. So I personally think that's all part of the body. I mean,
Yes.
it's hard. If you had a heat map, if church is a heat map, say, and you were able to measure that, I think you would see a very different picture of what is going on to what the church tends to count, which is Sunday attendance on a particular
Yes.
Sunday in the year, which is always in
Yeah.
decline, aside from the migrant congregations, which have made us look better. Certainly in London, I mean, 50% or so of Christians are in from African and Chinese churches. So
Right.
sorry, a lot of
Okay.
thoughts there, but
Well, that's you've taken us on a bit of a journey exactly in the area of our inquiry, actually, Johnny. So
Yes.
that's because I think, like you, we've talked about the two kind of potential kind of journeys that a lot of people who are involved in those previous mission or small missional groups, or some of them have looped back into the institution, becoming vicars or presumably pioneers through the CMS training stream as well. But there's a lot of people that certainly in anecdotally, and how on earth you would ever quantify this, I don't know, but that have ended up outside of church with a big C at very least. But then again, there's that same discussion. Well, that doesn't mean to say they're outside the church with a small c.
Yeah.
And I know
for sure,
Steve Aisthorpe's kind of challenge back when he wrote his book, must be 10 years ago now, was talking about the degree to which there were so many people who were in that category of outside church, but still actively seeking to make kind of meaningful journeys within the loose idea of the Christian tradition, that potentially you regard those as the body of Christ now, as much as any, if not more, as the remnants who still attend. But I mean, I suppose one just if you could say a little bit more about, because I know that the whole pioneer training thing has gone on quite a journey as well since you took that on, and since that developed. Do you see a change in the direction of what people are spending their time building now within community groups? Rather, because I guess at the beginning a lot of it was about the fresh expressions and equipping people to do fresh expressions more in a more wholesome and thoughtful way. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know where to dive in on that. I mean, I think fresh expressions, broadly was a good thing. It's this diffusion of innovation. It was naming all sorts of things that perhaps the church had done for years, like run toddler groups. And I mean, I remember my mum doing this in the village. It was all the mums, and they were the new people that were joining communities through those natural connection points into community or whatever. But I think fresh expressions gave a lot of momentum to that, and there was quite a lot of investment in missioners and a wider team, and that was documented quite well what was going on. So certainly by any kind of reckoning, let's say another diocese was added into the Church of England through that movement. And in 2019, this is very Church of England, but at the Synod, there was a recommendation 15 years on from Mission Shaped Church that every parish in the country should consider having a contextual expression of church. And that was adopted and accepted. And I thought that was a significant moment, like a tipping point thing. But, fast forward 6 months and COVID landed. And also, perhaps it's for a different podcast, but we could speculate on the reasons why. But the Church of England pulled money out of backing fresh expressions. I think it thought it was job done. And that was at the very point, in my view, when it should have doubled its investment, but it didn't. I mean, but you get these things that are flavour of the month. Rowan Williams was very in favour, and then you get a new archbishop and so on. So there's multiple reasons. But also, I think post-COVID, the church was much more anxious. It still is in some ways. Numbers have gone down a bit. Were they going to come back? And the kind of innovation that people always feel safer with is what looks like we already know. So church planting, for whatever reason, has grabbed the microphone and the attention. And, there's a bishop for church planting, Rick Thorpe, who, I'm one of these people who I'm kind of in favour of it all, but if you only get one thing, you've got a problem. And I think the church has tended to back and go for innovation that looks like what we already know. And that is not a futuring movement, in my view. Unless you've got much innovation that's much more out there, you're in trouble, really. But, what we've done at CMS from the get-go, and I'm super proud of CMS for this, really, is that CMS have backed me, which is shocking in itself, but, have backed the pioneering mission in this post-Christian context for over 20 years now, and are still investing in it, and now investing in new things like migration and those different congregations and so on. So there's new things on the horizon. But in doing that, learning from mission in other parts of the world, CMS has got a kind of imagination around faith and culture that's more prepared to be much more risky theologically and in practice around the kind of forms of church and what that looks like. So at CMS, the kinds of things we've done with pioneers is, yes, we have pioneers who've started new faith communities through, a boxing club or toddler groups or outdoors things, things that you guys will be familiar with. But probably about 35 to 40% of people that train with us do that kind of thing. But the other kinds of pioneering, we have a network of pioneers who they meet as a group called On the Edge, I think, and they're all in that post-church space. So that's where they do stuff. Okay. They're in care homes or doing music activities in pubs and listening to Nomad and who knows what else they're doing. So and other people started social enterprises. And so the landscape of mission that we've tried to paint at CMS is to enable people to innovate out of who they are in response to, the story of Christ, their love of Christ. And it's all good, Let's have newness in the world to join in with God's healing of all things. And some of that is, new communities of faith. And I'm all in favour of communities of faith where people flourish and grow and can do that stuff. But I'm also up for everything else. So yeah, we've kind of, if you like, the Fresh Expressions thing did its thing, which was good, and we were connected with that and knew those guys. But we were always pushing the edge a little bit beyond that as well. So I think if we had a tribe through what we've done at CMS of pioneers, I think they love the creative, innovative, the stuff that really pushes into community, that's future facing. But just a whole range and a whole mix, I think. So yeah,
that's great. Sorry, you were about to say something else? Sorry, cutting you off.
No.
Just, I suppose then, just thinking about all of those stories that are out there, which I think you may be right that perhaps when we kind of consumed information about those things through a certain number of blogs, that was kind of tended to be where we got lots of information about what was happening. We don't really have those kind of easy flows of information anymore, do we? In the same kind of way, we have diversity through all sorts of other things. So I guess my final question is more thinking about what stories are still important now. Who's telling them, and I guess from a more personal point of view, what is giving you inspiration right now, Jonny? What's moving you? What's giving you hope?
That's a good question. I mean, in terms of stories, I love creative practice. In a way, it doesn't matter whether it's with young people or last night I bumped into a friend, David, who trained with us, who set up this boxing community in Chelmsford, and he's now in Eastbourne, and he's connected with a local boxing club there, and they're in the church space, and I'm sure he'll grow a new community out of it. And that was great. It's just him doing his thing. So, I love hearing those stories of people who are at the edges in different ways. I love the kind of conversation we've got going on around migration and multicultural, intercultural communities, and the wrestle with that. So, yeah, I enjoy all of that, I think, in terms of stories. I mean, I think the complexity of access to those stories is a couple of things. One is it's much harder to know where you go to get that access, and the pressure's on you as a storyteller or blogger. You feel like you've got to publish in Instagram, X, Facebook, blog. So, or if you do publish on a blog, you've then got to go to all of those spaces and point to what you're doing, and then you think, oh well, perhaps I should start Substack. Is that where writers go now? So I think it's a much more confused world. But the reality is, if people's thing is Instagram, they tend to stay on that. So but I think that makes it much more demanding to put content out and connect with people. So that's one challenge, I think. But the other is that, the kind of old-fashioned, but the networking of, people colliding. I mean, I personally have a theory that emergence happens through collision. So you've got to bump into people.
Right.
And Greenbelt provided a space where that happened. Tautico provided a space where that happened. Online can provide a space where that happened. I think Nomad does seem to provide a space where that happens through the Listener Lounge. I've never been to the Listener Lounge, but I imagine. Or, through retreats that people are running off the back of those kinds of things. But my experience is it definitely takes time and capacity to animate networks.
Yes.
So the amount of effort that used to go into putting together the Greenbelt worship program or running a Tautico or whatever, it does need a belief in and some capacity for people who are able to sort of catalyze that kind of a gathering, which, I mean, we've been very committed to in our roles at CMS, but Greenbelt's still a collision point for me. But I think post-COVID, hopefully that's coming back a bit. But I mean, I always used to really appreciate you making the effort, Chris, to come down from Dunoon to Tautico or Greenbelt. But I think it was maybe it was a gut thing, but you felt the need to connect, and I think
absolutely
that needing to connect with people by having the intention to show up at wherever it is to meet as well as connect online is how movements grow and how movements work. So I think that, as well as stories, you need some sort of collision space or collision spaces, but where they are and who's facilitating them, I'm not sure. I mean, yeah.
Okay. The hope thing, I'm surprised you didn't mention woodlands.
Oh, that's another angle, yeah.
Yeah. For those of you that don't know, Jonny has been working in some woodlands that you have bought together with some friends. Is that right? I guess there's that whole area of how that connects us back with the earth and the sort of the first incarnation, as our blessed Richard Raw might call it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm on my own adventure, and in terms of me and life and faith, I've been very drawn to reading stuff around Indigenous, particularly Native American or First Nations sort of stuff, theology and relationship to the land. And I think the experience of managing a piece of woodland and allotment is good for me. Yeah, I mean, for me, friendships, spiritual direction is important. I mean, I'm a bit old-fashioned in terms of Christianity, and that I still quite passionate about the Bible and engaging that, albeit reading from the edges, spiritual direction, practices. Yeah, I mean, I kind of still try and have a flow of those things as well going on. But yeah.
Fabulous.
Brilliant.
Love it.
Well, Jonny, thank you so much for your time. That's there's loads of us to be thinking, for us to be thinking about then, and we're going to be reflecting on that. And we would love to kind of at some point to be able to be sharing with you a wider story of what Proost might yet become, building on what it was and the story that you and Ad and John, kind of all that effort you put in. And leading to burnout, I guess, as all these things tend to do if trying to do them in the margins of a busy life. So, yeah, thank you. And thank you very much for the chat.
Yeah, and just last thing to say, whether this is on the recording or not, is that when we passed Proost on to Andy, we basically passed it on with no controls.
Yeah.
I mean, by which I mean that, whatever the spirit of Proost is, it can change and move and be carried forward. But there's no sense in which with Andy, he needed to check in with us. And if you guys are picking it up, there's not a sense of, right, we don't want to become the new thought police.
Bless you. Thank you for that. But yeah, we hear
yes.
you.
Well, thank you for the freedom. Yeah. You may wish that you'd put some controls in the deal as the thing unfolds. We'll see. Okay. All the best then. I'm gonna stop the recording now, and thank you very much for the chat.
All right, Jonny. See you later.
Yeah.
So, welcome back. We are just a few weeks down the line from the end of the recording with Jonny's excellent interview, which we thoroughly enjoyed. The intention always for Rob and I, after just the depth of that and the detail of that, was to get together and spend a bit of time, maybe reflecting and just talking it through. That has been somewhat interrupted by rather momentous events in Rob's life.
Yeah.
So sometimes you need to take some time, and that's exactly what we've been doing. So sadly, Rob lost his mum in the intervening period.
Yeah.
So we decided we'd better, take a couple of weeks out, and that's effectively what we've done. And you're still in the middle of the awful administration of everything and funeral planning, but that's that. The funeral is next week, did you say?
Yeah, the cremation is on next Thursday, the 4th, and then the celebration service on Friday, the 5th. So, it's a very strange time. Very strange time. So it wouldn't have worked. Trying to reflect on Jonny, I think I'm in that sort of strange middle period now, where I think as a family we're just all waiting for the formalities, which sounds ever so grim, doesn't it? That alone sounds, but you can't avoid it.
We just spent half an hour talking through lots of aspects of this, because I'm also someone who's lost my mum, and I've been through very similar things. And that intermediate period that you're describing is weird, because time just doesn't play by the normal rules, does it? It kind of twists off into different experiences, different times.
Indeed.
So much to do, but also sometimes it just you don't know where to start. So
Yeah.
I think those of us that have been through that will entirely understand what you're going through, and just wish you every joy and every
Thank you.
lightness in the
Yeah.
amidst all the loss and the awfulness as well.
I will say one thing quickly though. I realise it's only at these times when you realise your default ways of coping, and my default ways of coping are clearly keeping busy and listening to things, so I don't have to listen to my own thoughts. Because I think it's only when I think it must have been last Sunday or something, I stopped and decided I wouldn't go and do something. I'd just sit and read a book. And that was the saddest I felt during the whole time, because I think I just allowed the quiet,
Yeah,
and then then things come to the surface. I know it wasn't sad, but you have to allow yourself to do that, don't you? I think.
You do.
But we had a marvellous conversation. We've just listened to a marvellous conversation with Jonny, haven't we? I thought that was great.
Yeah. I think, I suppose the early stuff with the discussion around the early life of Proost and its coming into being was a real trip down lovely memories for me. There's lots of elements of that which were really special, So, and it was great to hear him reflecting on that from a totally from a very different perspective to mine. And obviously Jonny was involved in the very beginning. I was interested to hear their plan that actually Proost was to be a record label.
Yes, that was fascinating.
That was good fun. Obviously, it became something very different to that, but always did produce music. So that's yeah.
I think it was always, what struck me most of all, I think, was that it was always the work of a community. And these things that Jonny and other people in the network, if you like, had come across in their travels or in their work or even in their place of worship, they were willing to share those with other people simply because they felt it could be of benefit, or a blessing is probably a better word. And I think that's where I thought that was fascinating, that idea, and it's something we've spoken about, isn't it, Chris? The idea of community and how you create that community, which the output is some sort of work of art, however you want to define art.
Yeah,
I really like that. I also liked the fact that there was very little. It was deliberately open, very little control. I think Jonny used the word, or I might have applied it. There was very little thought police. We didn't. There was no one going, "Oh no, that you can't put that in there. That's too extreme one way or the other." I like that.
Yeah, I wonder if they ever, did suck their cheeks in and say, "No, we can't go that far." I wonder if there was anything they ever decided. No, that's. Yeah, there are limits, but for all of us, maybe, I don't know. Perhaps they didn't. I mean, there was some fairly kind of left field stuff being published. So.
I mean, are those limits just my lack of, or where my experience ends? And I've not experienced anything like that
well,
before.
Indeed,
and therefore I feel like I need to rein it in.
Yeah, and maybe if you, from that point of view, the whole point is that the edges is where things are interesting, and the edges will always be pushing those limits, particularly for people who are perhaps more in the middle of the sort of the tradition, that whatever it is that's been forcing other things to the edge. I mean, I suppose.
I'm interested. Go on.
No,
you go on.
No, on you go.
Well, no, I think I was interested in one of the remarks he made was that it was always artful and not. We mentioned this earlier when we weren't recording. This wasn't missiological, and now I understand what missiological means. I like the idea. I'm very much drawn to the idea of the sense of creating something because that's what's on your heart, rather than creating something because you want something out of that.
It kind of removes
creating
the hard sell, and just kind of says, "Here I am." Yeah, I like that too. Yeah,
and I also think that's something which it's meaningful for me in that I suppose my hope for Proost in 2024 and onwards is that's what it's kind of like. It is a community encouraging people and supporting people to express their art in safety, in a supported environment, where there's very little, if any, thought police.
yes,
We might be helping. I'd like to think there's an element of guiding and support, helping. That's not the same thing, is it?
yeah. So
Taking something raw and creating something out of it.
yeah,
I like that.
absolutely. So the second half, I guess we were starting to look forward and starting to think about the current context as opposed to the context that Proust grew into, and we were wondering about this business about Proust initially seemed to be a fairly loose tribe of people that were travelling under a set of labels which mainly we're not using anymore. And I was kind of interested to know from Jonny, whether he felt. Well, I suppose I asked, what happened to that tribe, but I don't think we really kind of got a fulsome answer to that. But I mean, maybe there isn't a fulsome answer to be had to that because those people are, a lot of them are still around, they're doing all sorts of different things.
Yeah.
But also, okay, if that tribe isn't a tribe anymore, what is the current tribe that might? It's interesting that Jonny turned to the Steve Aisthorpe research, which is something we had also been talking about previously, and trying to understand how people have become a diaspora from church, and lots of former, kind of activists within church are now maybe finding church very difficult, or at least some of them are. But by the same token,
in my note,
just by the same token, it's also quite clear that Jonny himself remains committed to the church with a capital C, and is still very much at the heart of that. So it's not that these things no longer have people pushing at the edges of that envelope too.
He made a remark. I think we specifically asked him where are the new things, and one of the responses was they're not really organised groups. So these things are happening, but they're not in any organised way. I was fascinated by, interested by he referred to the 2019 Church of England Synod, saying that every church should have a contextual expression. Subsequently, they stopped funding it, and then subsequently we had COVID. I think that, and he referred to post-COVID church anxiety, and going back to what you know rather than being willing to innovate. So, maybe the things are happening very much on the edge, or are sort of people who are no longer in organised or traditional models of church. That could be part of it. Where things are perhaps a bit more risky. I think maybe that maybe understandably in a traditional church setting you have to have quite a courageous leadership team to be too edgy. And outside of that you can do whatever you like, I suppose.
I suppose it is interesting how the discussion about what has happened to church is inseparable from the discussion about what Proost was and what Proost might be.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I anymore feel committed in any way to the church. I feel committed to an exploration and an idea of a releasing of Jesus, of meaning, of new stories of hope, of prophetic criticism of culture, of new artistic engagement with those issues. Those things excite me still. But I've spent a lot of my life trying to kind of cling on to make church work, and I really don't have any interest in doing that anymore. I'm still grateful that some people do, but I'm interested, I suppose, in the threads of that discussion with Jonny as to the degree to which a new Proost becomes part of the reinvigoration of church, or whether it becomes a reinvigoration of a spiritual movement beyond church. And I don't really know. I mean, it wouldn't be for me or any of us to decide. It would be for whatever community came together around Proost to decide. But yeah, that's I guess that's after the discussion. I still feel myself tussling with that. I still feel myself.
I suspect it would be a both and.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
It doesn't. It's if traditional models of church get value out of anything which is grown out of the Proost community, then great.
I wonder when I hear you saying both and, I actually wonder if it always was. Whether there were always those kind of two tensions, maybe not even tensions, polarities within the old Proost, that some people would have been firmly still within the institution, and other people would have had at least one foot out the door, kind of thing.
Yeah. If you think about the conversation we had a while ago now about the labyrinth, well, we used that in a traditional church setting, but and only for the church we were in, that was very, very new. Other people might have said, "Oh no, I've known about labyrinths for decades," but sometimes it's just because it's new or new to the person on the receiving end is what I'm trying to get at. That's as much as anything the beauty of it all, isn't it? Just somebody sees something and gets to experience something afresh or in a different way, which they've never experienced before. I think that's smart. That is a great blessing to everybody, the giver and the receiver, I should think.
Anyway, Rob, we said 5 minutes. I'm looking at the time run here, and it's saying 15:45 at the moment. So I think we'd better wrap up this discussion. And, once again, thanks to Jonny. I think that was a really generous and really helpful discussion that we had from him and with him. And I'm hoping that we will generate some further discussion from all sorts of stuff that comes out of that as the next period unfolds.
Yeah, what I would say is feel free, when we publish this, if people want to leave comments on the group or get in touch in any way, please do.
Please do.
Please do, and we'll start. That starts starting the conversation is brilliant. Is what we're kind of hoping to achieve.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks everyone. All the best. Cheers.
Yeah.
Bye.
Speak to you all again. Bye for now.